G'day, this is a training video looking at how we can improve our approach to using brush cutters as far as a way of managing vegetation. Now, I'm sitting on the Puffing Billy railway line in amongst a bit of area remnant vegetation, which has got some pretty special values. Now, Puffing Billy has an obligation to reduce fuel load because we're running a steam train, and steam uses fire and we get sort of hot ash and things that spits out of the fire engine as it moves along the railway line. So we need to be thinking about that as a risk management sort of program. So the purpose of today's exercise is to really look at a site where we've got mixed values. We've got some good areas of remnant vegetation and we've got areas of weedy grasses predominantly, which do need to be managed to reduce their risk as far as fire or fuel management. So the purpose of today is really to look at different situations, different scenarios that we can assess when we're doing the job of fire management, but assess the site and identify the values and modify our approach. Do we really need to slash the whole area, or do we just need to slash the weedy bits where it's most obvious? And are there other methods that we can do to reduce the fire risk, such as lightly raking off the fine litter, but leaving the understory, which is, in this case here, mostly non-flammable, low-growing native plants which are doing the job that they're designed to do in terms of providing colour and diversity and deep-rooted, protecting the soils and protecting the trees and the other things that are growing here. Okay, now when we're talking about significant species, when we have a look around here, there's three really important plants that I want to focus on. The first one here is this gorgeous looking plant called creamy candles, Stackhausia. It's a lovely little herbaceous plant. It's got really sweet, flat smelling flowers at night, so it's a moth pollinated plant. Grows a beautiful ground cover. It's got lovely white creamy flowers and it's non-flammable. And there's a lovely patch of it here. There's another plant over here that I want to show you. It's called handsome flat pea. This is another local native ground cover plant. Got beautiful egg and bacon flowers that last for quite a period of time, so it adds quite a bit of colour in terms of ground layer. And it doesn't grow much higher than about 5-6 centimetres high. And again, it's a non-flammable plant, but it's binding the soil and providing lots of habitat for insects and wildlife and things. This other plant over here is called mountain correa. Now this is a state significant species. It's only found in a very small number of places within Victoria, one of which happens to be along parts of the railway line in the adjoining road reserve. Now unfortunately this plant gets brush cut every year. Advanced plants like this one are able to survive the brush cutting, but any seedling recruitment that happens nearby gets taken out when we come through with the whippersnippers. Do we really need to take out this particular plant? No, we don't. There are some other great ground cover plants through here which again reduce fuel loads, protect the soil and add colour and value to the site, like this beautiful little native violet, and here we've got a little native speedwell. These gorgeous little blue purple flowers. When we walk onto a site, one of the first things we need to be looking for is looking at where are the fuel loads? What are the plants that are present on site which are posing concern as far as posing a potential threat in terms of a fire risk? One of the things that we've found in respect of a lot of our vegetation throughout the area is that it's actually, in most cases, it's actually a lot of the introduced grass weeds that actually pose the biggest problem. These are grasses that are quite common along the railway line and elsewhere within the urban environment, and these are now finishing their life cycle. We're now at the end of spring, so the plants have finished their main growth period, lots of dead leaves present, they've produced flowers and the plants are now starting to die back. So really what we need to be doing is we need to be trying to reduce the amount of annual grasses that are establishing on the railway zone. Now they're establishing because our treatment is we come along and slash them at the end of their life cycle. If we slash them before they start to set seed, then we could stop a lot of seed set, and thereby the number of plants that we regenerate next year would be much fewer. One of the most common weedy grasses within this site is a plant called sweet vernal. Now sweet vernal, as you can see, has got a fairly light amount of leaf growth, but it grows a fairly tall stem with a bit of a fluffy flower head on the end of it. Now it's the fluffy flower heads that dry off that actually add to the fuel load. In this site here we can see there's lots of native grasses growing in amongst where the sweet vernal's growing. One of the dominant grasses here is the native weeping grass, Microlina. Now the beauty of Microlina is that it's an evergreen grass. It actually grows all year round. So it's green for most of the year. And as you can see, it's a relatively short growing grass with lots of fine leaves. It forms a fairly dense mat. You can in fact actually use this as an alternative lawn species. The beauty of the Microlina is it only flowers once a year, which is in the spring. So if we were to apply a management program here using a whippersnipper, we could lightly cut off the flower heads of the sweet vernal and leave the bulk of the Microlina, the weeping grass, intact underneath. By rethinking what we're trying to do, we can both reduce effort, because there's some areas that we can say, well, we don't need to slash here, we can apply some other method, or by getting the timing right, we can actually reduce the amount of fuel that's going to grow from the following season by treating it before the seeds flower and set seed. So I mentioned before about the importance of assessing the site before we start work. We've got a really good example here. If you have a look through, you'll notice that the bulk of the plants that are growing on site are less than 5 centimetres high. Are they really a problem in terms of fuel management? No, they're not. But it's got high biodiversity values. We've got lots of little native plants growing in here, exactly the sorts of plants that we want to bind the soil and to provide the habitat and to provide a bit of variety and landscape value to the passengers travelling past on the train. But if we really think at this, if we really look at the site, we'll see it's not the plants that are the problem, it's the light litter. It's all these little small branches and twigs and things. So if we're really worried about fuel management, we don't need to brush cut here, but it might be useful at some stage to come and lightly rake off the fine fuel that doesn't require large amounts of work and effort, but can be effective in terms of its treatment. The important thing to consider here is timing. Do we do it now, or do we wait for a couple of more weeks and let the stackhouses finish flowering? They'll set seed, and the seed can then shed back onto the soil, and it's able to regenerate the following season. So we actually get more wildflowers. But if we do the treatment too early, then we're going to knock the flowers off, which is going to stop it from producing the seed which we want it to happen. So timing's important. But in terms of timing, if we have a look over here, you'll see this is where we need to focus our efforts in terms of brush cutting. It's these weedy grass thickets. These are the patches that we really need to focus on if we're worried about fuel management. So we can work on these patches now, reduce the flower heads and cut the fuel loads down, and then come back a little bit later, perhaps in 2 or 3 weeks' time, and then treat the litter that's sitting on the ground. We don't need to go through and bare earth this site by cutting the site too low. We're encouraging grass weeds and encouraging flatweeds, which smother out the native plants. So the timing. This is a really good area where we can demonstrate that. We can go through and we can selectively hand weed out some of the weedy grasses growing in amongst the good stuff, which protects the conservation values of the site. We then come back through, do a light raking when the plants have finished flowering and seed set. So that protects those plants for the following season. And in the process, we're able to reduce the litter load, which is really the main concern as far as the fuel management that needs to be addressed on site. So it's a combination of techniques that can be applied to, 1, protect the site values, and 2, meet our legal obligations in terms of reducing fuel loads as part of our fire management program. Okay, so the key to this training video is really talking about technique. It's not what we do as far as whippersnipping, it's how we do it. So there's things that we need to think about in terms of the adverse impact that it might have on the native vegetation that's present within the site. There's a few different things we need to consider. First of all is the effect of using a whippersnipper and too close to the base of some of our trees and shrubs, what we call ring barking. Now it's often done because we think that plants growing around the base of the trees are all going to burst into flames when the fire moves through. That's not necessarily the case. But we can certainly reduce the fuel around the base of the tree without killing the tree or damaging the tree in the process. So it's about thinking about the distance of the whippersnipper away from the base of the plant. We want to stop ring barking. If the trees are small, the trees and the shrubs are small enough and they get ring barked, it actually kills them. And in the case of things like mountain correa, state significant species, we don't want to be doing that. We want to be trying to protect and preserve these site features. So simple things by cutting back away from the base of the plant. It only needs to be a couple of inches, and that's determined by the tip of the end of the cord. So we want to be using the brush cutter just a short distance away from the base of the plant. And here's a quick demonstration that we can show exactly what I mean. The other thing we want to avoid doing is bare earthing. As I mentioned before, there's this belief that the shorter we cut it, to create bare soil, therefore the less likelihood there's going to become a fire risk, but that's not always the case. The problem with bare earthing is that it actually damages the native vegetation, encourages further weed growth, and particularly encourages things like these flatweeds. Then the flatweeds have a particular effect on native veg because of the way they grow. They outcompete and shade out and smother out all the native plants like this beautiful creamy stackhausia. So if we're going to protect these site values in the long term, we want to be making sure that what we're doing in the way of management's not encouraging the weeds which are destroying the site values that we're designed to protect in the first place. The other effect of brush cutting is the slash that's left behind quite often after we've gone through an area of particularly weedy grasses. Now this slash sits on the surface of the soil, of course smothers any native plants that's sitting underneath, and as it breaks down creates this nutrient-enriched thatch, which is often embedded with weed seed, which then regenerates back in the following autumn and starts to outcompete and knock out a lot of the native plants that might be still present on site. Ideally, if we've got the opportunities, we should be lightly raking the slash off once the brush cutting's gone through to both protect the values but also to remove the slash, which in itself is fuel for a potential fire. There's another important thing we need to think about, and that's the direction of the slash in terms of where we're going to cut the material. Brush cutters throw their material anti-clockwise, so if we work from the left-hand side of the site, cutting along the edge and cutting the material into the weed zone, we're going to minimise spread of seed out onto the good areas located on the outside edge. So to avoid these problems, we need to be thinking, one, about the distance that we cut around base of plants and shrubs, but two, about the cutting height in respect to the site itself. In most cases, we're talking about 50 mil cut. We don't need to cut the vegetation any shorter than that. 50 millimeters. That's sufficient to reduce the main growth of the plant as far as its leaf growth and particularly the flower stems. But in doing so, we're not scalping the soil, which is impacting on these plants. It's these little native violets and these other little low-growing ground cover plants that are providing the soil protection and not providing a fuel risk, and are actually adding a bit of a diversity and colour to the site in terms of its environmental values. So cutting height's very important. Okay, so let's just do a quick summary of the key steps in the process of using a whippersnipper in a safe and efficient and environmentally friendly manner. The first thing we do is we walk onto the site and we have a quick look around and we identify site features in terms of areas of remnant vegetation which have low fuel values which do not require cutting. We then identify patches of weedy grasses which do need to be trimmed. So we think about the safety, look for any hazards in terms of light branches which we remove before we start doing any work. We also need to think about the edges in terms of trying to minimise spread of seed onto good areas when we're actually doing the task of the whippersnipping. So the main purpose of this training video is to show that we can work together. We can meet what has been seen as conflicting objectives. We can actually look after and protect areas of remnant vegetation and wildlife habitat, whilst at the same time reducing fuel loads and minimising risk and working together to protect the overall environmental values.